I had just met John at a party. I didn't know him. He wasn't a good friend. He came to the first conference. His book was #1, Megatrends was #1 on the best-selling list and stayed there for more than a year. And I think it was his generosity at the first TED conference by giving the opening talk and staying around for the whole time, taking notes and giving a marvelous kind of wind-up summary of it that gave it a lot of its credibility. So I'm always in his debt. John Naisbitt.
Thank you. Could we have the house lights up? I'm sort of customer-driven, and I want to... Thank you. I'd like to, after the... No, it's okay. I'd like to, and thanks for having me follow the Animal Acts, Ricky. I'd like to kind of enlarge the context and indeed return to China following last night's performance, which is remarkable. But during this conference, at least at the very beginning of it, of course, a very extraordinary thing happened. Deng Xiaoping died. He died Wednesday night on the 19th, just before, not long before midnight. And as some of you may know, China is on the same time zone with Hong Kong. He died Wednesday night, and the next day the Hong Kong Stock Exchange shot up 300 points, an increase of more than 2%, which I think is a kind of altogether appropriate salute to a man who said, "To get rich is glorious." Actually, my friends in Hong Kong tell me that everyone was so relieved after this long wait that it finally happened. But Deng Xiaoping, of course, is the end of this long period and this kind of long list of revolutionary heroes. And now the technocrats are taking over. Deng did have the grace to die slowly for 6, 7, 8 years, and so the leadership arrangements in China are really pretty much settled in. And now in China we have the closest thing, I guess we're going to get for a while, to a new paramount leader, Jiang Zemin, who holds all of the three major positions. He's head of the army, he's head of the Communist Party, and he's president of China. And last night in his wonderful talk, Li Yu said that the death of Deng Xiaoping signals the beginning of the Tiananmen Square generation moving toward leadership. That sounds right. But in the meantime, there is a perhaps transition government headed by Jiang Zemin. Jiang Zemin is not known in the West very well at all. We just see him with those big glasses. But we're going to be hearing an awful lot about Jiang Zemin in the days to come. And last March, 11 months ago, I had a 2-hour private meeting with Jiang Zemin, and I would like to talk just a little bit about that experience as we kind of anticipate a little bit what this new leader is all about. I was taken in Beijing to the compound where all the leaders live, and we met in the room where Mao used to receive visitors, and Jiang now receives them, and he lives in this part of the compound. I was really quite struck when I walked down the hall and turned the corner, and it was a very staged thing. There was Jiang Zemin standing right under a very strong light. And it was like he was just, ready to receive, and that there was some sort of creating some sort of aura. He greeted me, and we sat down next to each other with a table in front and an interpreter in the back. And he sat with his legs much as I have. And the first thing I noticed were his boots. He had some cut-off boots. Jiang Zemin is a little taller than average height for a Chinese. But I noticed that the heel was about this high. So he had added an inch or so to his height. The other thing I noticed was how very smooth his skin is. And I hadn't really thought about it or asked how old he was, but I judged that he was about 54, 55, something like that. Jiang Zemin will be 71 in July, and I invite you to look at the pictures of him when you see them to see how young. Maybe he sleeps at night, I just don't know. Now, this was the end of March a year ago, and you'll recall that the missiles were going up the strait, and we didn't, between China and Taiwan, and we didn't talk very much about that, but he did say at one point that there was only one message to Taiwan from China. There's only one message. He said they can have their own army. They can have their own political system. They can have this and that, their banking system. He said, but they must not try independence. And you know, the Chinese have this thing about being humiliated for 150 years since the Opium Wars. And that's why Hong Kong, among other things, is so important to them, to their face, because Britain took it from them 150 years ago in the first Opium War. Later, and I'm going to digress a little bit, later I was in Shanghai, and during the time that I was in Beijing and the missiles were going off, there were 12 entrepreneurs from Shanghai who had gone to Taipei to do business, to make some deals. And one of them was a friend of mine who has the taxi franchise in Shanghai, and he created a joint venture with an insurance company. So while the missiles were flying and the governments of China and Taiwan were posturing, down on the ground, business was going on as usual. And indeed, I think the really big story, even then a year ago, the really big story is the integration of the economies of Taiwan and China. People on Taiwan have invested officially more than $27 billion in China. A lot of people think it's closer to 50 million. There are tens of thousands of joint ventures between Chinese on Taiwan and Chinese on the mainland. And a year ago, October, China Air, the airline of Taiwan, painted all the Taiwanese flags off the tails of their airplanes and replaced them with lotus blossoms, realizing, of course, that when they get direct air traffic, they can't very well fly into China with a Taiwanese flag on the tail. President Jiang and I talked a lot about China's economic reforms, and at one point he asked me, what do you think China's greatest economic problem is? And I said, well, Mr. President, I don't really think that that would be for me to say. And he urged me to tell him what I and my colleagues talked about. And I said, well, what we think is the biggest problem is how do you do something about doing something about the lack of efficiency on those state enterprises, those great state companies, at the same time without creating too much unemployment, that balancing act. And he said, yes, that's exactly what our biggest problem is. That's what we're trying to do. He said, we have a saying around here. We have a saying that says, seize the big ones and let the little ones go. And I thought as he said that, I sure hope I'm one of the little ones. He told me that some of the regions complain that other regions in China are growing faster. And he said, we always quote Deng Xiaoping, who said, it is all right for some to get rich before others. Now, during the first hour, he spoke Chinese, and of course, all of the heads of state speak their own language, but he began to correct the interpreter as we got through the end of the first hour, and he would say in English, no, here's what I mean, and he would tell me in English what he meant. And as we got into the second hour, and we're talking about more personal things, he absolutely switched to English. And his staff told me later they had never seen that happen before. We talked about our growing up. He grew up on a farm in central China. I grew up on a sugar beet farm in southern Utah. We talked a little bit about that. He attended Jiaotang University in Shanghai, one of the most famous universities in Shanghai. And as it happened, I'd lectured there just the week before. We talked about that. And then he talked about his education as an engineer. And he talked about the books that he read. He said in civil engineering, these books were from the West, mostly from England and the United States. In civil engineering, I read Cleaver and Marshall. I'm making these names up, but he told me who they were. In civil engineering, I read Cleaver and Marshall. Electrical engineer, it was Brown and Doe, whatever. And he went through about 20 books. You know, I can't remember my professors. It was just an extraordinary performance. And then he went to graduate school in engineering in Russia, and he speaks fluent Russian, he speaks fluent Romanian, and this is part of the thing I think that impresses some of his colleagues. And then he made a big point about how some of the texts today are Chinese, and by Chinese engineers, and that they're really pushing at that. And he told me about during the Cultural Revolution, how he had spent 6 years in an automobile plant on the assembly line in Shanghai. He's quite a student of the United States, and on the spot, you can imagine this, on the spot he recited the Gettysburg Address in full. And you know, I spent a lot of time in Asia, and I have a place in Kuala Lumpur where I base out of, and it's quite striking to me how much more people in Asia know about the West and how little people in the West know about Asia. But here he was reciting by heart the Gettysburg Address. Well, it was a little surrealistic, I must say. Here was the leader of 1.2 billion people in 5,000-year-old China reciting the Gettysburg Address to a citizen of 220-year-old United States. Well, the jury is still out. Is Jiang Zemin a real leader, or perhaps just a professional charmer? Thank you. I can take questions or donate my time to the TED Time Bank.
You have
Is that the one?
We have to.
That's the one.
We're more than an hour over. All right.
Thank you.
We just. Thank you so much. That was exactly what I wanted. That was perfect. Perfect.